So welcome back. My name is John Perrottet. I think I was introduced earlier to you. I work in the tourism team here in Washington. And building on this morning's kind of rich conversation that we've had, it's time for moving to the second session where we've got even more for you. Before we start with that, I wanted to just remind you that this event's being live streamed, that there are questions coming in. If you have questions, don't forget to use the cards. There should be plenty of those around. If there are none on your seat, I can notice there's the odd seat that might have one on it nearby. So please keep those questions coming. As a former panellist in today's session, I can assure you they really do keep panellists on their toes. And panellists do have to think a little bit about how to answer some of those questions. Sometimes they have to think pretty hard about how to interpret them. So please have those questions coming forward. And of course, all tweets well received on the hashtag tourism for development. So this afternoon, the bank, of course, is pleased to also launch a second report, Tourism and the Sharing Economy, Policy and Potential of Sustainable Peer-to-Peer Accommodation. Like the first one, that's kind of a bit of a mouthful as well. And this report sort of investigates the opportunities and challenges of the peer-to-peer accommodation sector. It focuses just on the accommodation piece, and provides sort of developing and emerging nations, the ones that we're most concerned about, information, guidelines, opportunities and recommendations as to how to better use this new business model that's emerging, and how to do that for sustainable and inclusive tourism. Topics you're going to hear a little bit more about as we progress through the remainder of the afternoon. And I'd firstly like to congratulate the authors of this report, Louise Twining-Ward from our own office, and Martina Becker. Martina Becker and Louise have put this report together, and they've been supported, by the way, with the help of the Caribbean Tourism Organisation through their collaboration, to collect our thoughts and generate discussion points and information. You all have copies of this report. If you haven't, there are some outside, there are some near the where the food was served. You should not leave here today without one of those. And I'm going to now introduce the people who are going to present this material to you. And the first of those is Louise. Louise Twining-Ward is a senior tourism development consultant in our team here in Washington. And she's spent her entire career really working in sustainable tourism and has led, in fact, the bank's work in this whole digital platforms interface with the tourism sector. And we're very grateful for that. Prior to that, she was president and CEO of Sustainable Travel International. Martina Becker is a senior tourism consultant also on our team here, and she specialises in inclusive tourism. And she's focused in her career on tourism and developing in emerging nations for the last 20 years, it says here. So these two presenters are going to put their thoughts forward about the content of this report for your benefit, and that will be followed by a panel discussion of the implications of their work. And that panel is going to be moderated by Isabel Hill, who I will now quickly introduce. She's the Director of the National Travel and Tourism Office here in the US as part of the Department of Commerce. Many of you in tourism will know her well. Her team has a pretty serious responsibility. There are many, but one of them is for developing the national tourism strategy for the US and for fostering the competitiveness of that industry and all the various industries that benefit from it. She also chairs the OECD Tourism Committee and represents the US in bilateral and multilateral forums in relation to matters pertaining to tourism. So let me now call on, firstly, all of the authors of the report to present their material, and if Isabel could bring her panel to the stage. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, John, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for staying around after lunch. I hope you all had a great lunch. It's a great honour here to be this afternoon launching this report. I'm going to start with a story as we're kind of in the after-lunch session. I'm going to take you back. When I was a girl, I used to remember the excitement of going with my father to the local library, looking at travel books, looking at maps. Then we used to go to the travel agent. You know, a couple of weeks later, a big brown envelope would arrive in the mail, and there were our tickets. You know, fast forward 40 years. Okay, that ages me. But now I can do it all in a matter of minutes on my phone. You know, I can choose between hotels and homestays. I can add a night on the fly. I can add a meal. I can communicate directly with the provider of my accommodation. I can even have Siri direct me to the destination. So instead of staying in an official hotel, I can stay with a real person. I can stay in a real neighborhood. And I can get a real taste for life. And that really changes how we see travel. And this is what peer-to-peer accommodation, as we're calling it, this is a strange situation here, here we go, is all about. Peer-to-peer accommodation is personal. Digital platforms have disrupted the whole tourism value chain. This means new opportunities for some, as we heard from Carmen earlier, in terms of the future of work, and less opportunities for others. It also leaves some regulators kind of scrambling for a response. The accommodation economy, the P2P accommodation economy, is made up of three key parts: the digital platform, the provider of accommodation, and the guest. So the platform provides kind of an online marketplace and enables the guest to communicate directly with the provider. And then the system of two-way reviews helps keep the provider honest and keep the guest well behaved. So why should the World Bank care about this? You heard a lot about the twin goals earlier this morning. We know from research conducted in this institution that the fastest route out of poverty is a job. When people get jobs, their kids go to school. Their families are healthier and their communities are stronger. So these kinds of opportunities really matter. But along with these opportunities come risks for destinations. And we heard a little bit about some of those risks this morning. We have hotel associations in the Caribbean up in arms about Airbnb. Let's just be candid today. This is an open conversation. We have community groups in New York protesting against destruction of community and gentrification. And we have destination managers who are asking us, how do I respond to this new phenomenon? So this study aims to take a neutral look at this. It's our first research into peer-to-peer accommodation, this subsector, as we call of tourism. It was designed as a foundation for future work. And here it is. It includes some of the latest research. It includes a lot of examples, some facts and figures, and a deep dive into the case study of Jamaica that Martina's going to present in a minute. So what are some of the top-level findings? We estimate about 8 million beds in P2P accommodation. That's about 7% of the global inventory of accommodation. Between now and 2025, we anticipate a 31% growth rate in supply. So that's 6 times the growth rate expected for bed and breakfasts. While growth initially occurred faster in Europe, it's now shifted to East Asia and Pacific. So what are the pros and cons of this new form of accommodation? Our research highlights 10 opportunities and challenges. I'm not going to go through all of them today, but I'm going to highlight 3. 2 opportunities and 1 challenge. Inclusion is a word you've heard a lot today already. It's, I would say, the key opportunity here. Airbnb-type platforms enable the participation of individuals who normally be excluded, who normally wouldn't have a role in tourism. It removes some, but not all, as we'll see later in the discussion, of the barriers to entry. It means I don't have to have a personal website. It means I don't have to communicate directly with my guests. I can do it through the provider. There's more than 1 million women who are hosting on Airbnb, and 59% of Airbnb's super-performing hosts, the platform's top hosts, are women. But there are regional disparities. We've also been lucky enough to receive data from homestay.com, and you can see the regional disparities there, whereas 76% of Australian hosts are female, only 30% of Asian hosts. So inclusion doesn't happen everywhere, and it doesn't necessarily happen on its own. Just because it's P2P doesn't necessarily going to mean it's always going to be more inclusive. The second area I wanted to highlight is opportunities for diversification. This morning we talked a bit about over-tourism. That came up a lot. So when I talk about diversification, I'm talking both geographically and demographically. So first, demographically, currently 62% of guests are what we think of as the millennials, and I'm extending it a bit here with 18 to 35-year-olds. But we know that P2P has a potential, and it's expanding to new markets. And we know it has the potential to attract new types of visitors to destinations. So the older visitors are starting to use P2P as well, when having a lot of domestic visitors starting to use P2P. And this also can have the opportunity to diversify geographically tourism in a destination and reduce the honeypot effect of over-tourism, as different demographics like to go to different places. The third area I wanted to highlight from the report is about sustainability. That's responsible management. What does responsible management look like in this take down the barriers, remove the regulation type of field? It's great for inclusion, and the regulators are scrambling. So we've got this kind of dichotomy going on. People who offer their rooms to rent, for rent, who were not formally in the tourism value chain, probably don't know all the regulations. They're probably not well connected to the regulators or the hotel associations. They don't have an advocacy group necessarily, although that is starting to change. They may not be aware of environmental regulations and fire and health and safety issues. They may not be registered. They're starting to in some places, but they may not be following standards. So bringing down the barriers comes at a cost and at a risk. And this is the balancing act we're playing here. They may not be paying tourist taxes. They may or may not be using more or less resources environmentally. But if they're not paying taxes, they're not contributing to the maintenance of those resources, which they are having an impact on. So this is a very polarizing subject. There are pros and cons in this debate. And it's very important to understand all the issues at hand before taking a stance. In short, sustainable P2P is not going to happen on its own. There are huge opportunities for inclusion for women and for marginalised communities, for rural areas, but it's not going to happen on its own. So to find out a little bit more about how this plays out in just one place, we decided to do an impact assessment of P2P in Jamaica. And so to share some of the results of that, Martina is going to come up. Thank you, Martina.
Thank you very much, Louise. You mentioned inclusion as one of the opportunities of P2P accommodation. So before I'm going to share the findings of the case study, I would like to introduce Gloria to you. When I was in Jamaica, I was visiting the Trenchtown Culture Yard, a small museum in Kingston, Jamaica. And Gloria was working there, and we started chatting. And she mentioned, when I mentioned why I was in Jamaica, she took me by the hand and took me next door where she was living. And she showed me a room she had prepared for guests. She mentioned that she had listed it on Airbnb, but hadn't received any bookings yet. So she was quite disappointed about that. And that made me realize how important this work is. What do we need to do to make sure that Gloria is successful? So much of the work on P2P accommodation, the research is done in cities in Europe and North America, where they deal with very different issues. Jamaica, however, provides a very different case study. It's a mature tourism destination. looking to diversify from the sun, sea and sand product. The 3 resort areas, Montego Bay, Negril and Ocho Rios, receive almost 80% of all tourism arrivals, and many of them staying in all-inclusive resorts. So to get an understanding of the accommodation or the P2P accommodation in Jamaica, the bank interviewed government officials, P2P providers and other stakeholders. We conducted a focus group with P2P providers and collected data through a survey conducted by the Jamaica Home Sharing Association. The bank was very fortunate to receive data from Airbnb, TripAdvisor Rentals, Homestay.com, the Caribbean Tourism Organization and the Jamaica Tourism Board. So when we look at the size of the P2P accommodation economy in Jamaica, we can see that Airbnb is the main player in terms of number of listings. Based on this figure, we used Airbnb as a proxy, also because we received a comprehensive set of data from them over the last 4 years. When we look at these numbers, we should keep in mind that many providers list on multiple platforms, so we should not be adding these numbers up. Let me see. The number of Airbnb guests grew significantly over the last few years, but still represent just 2.4% of all international arrivals in 2017. Airbnb listings generated thereby $9.4 million in total income for the Jamaican host during that year. Out of just 3,000 hosts listed on Airbnb, just over 2,000 had ever received at least one booking during their time on the platform. That also means that 35% of all hosts had never received a booking. We can conclude that supply is outstripping demand here in Jamaica. For hosts that had received at least one or more booking in 2017, the average occupancy level was relatively low. 20 nights a year, with 25 nights for entire homes and 13 nights for private rooms. And what we see is that a small group of hosts receive much higher booking rates, while a large group receives very low number of booking rates. In terms of inclusion, what we found in Jamaica was that educated professionals who can offer a well-maintained property with security to their guests are much more likely to be successful. We also found that P2P accommodation in Jamaica is commercializing. Home sharing is giving way to commercial rentals. Of all Airbnb listings in Jamaica, 71%, the chart is waiting, sorry, 71% are for entire homes or apartments, and the majority of these are non-primary residences and not host-present rentals. There is currently significant construction going on in Jamaica, especially in Kingston, where purpose-built P2P accommodation is being bought up by investors. So what we think of traditional homestays are very much the minority, representing maybe less than 30% of all listings. When we look at gender inclusion, next slide, Gloria again here, we found that women hosts are in the majority, just as elsewhere in the world. They represent 53% of all Airbnb hosts in Jamaica. For Homestay.com, which only offers host-present rentals, this percentage is 73%. What we don't know yet, however, is how the total income of women compares to that of men. And hosting cannot be considered full-time employment for most hosts, but it does provide significant supplemental income for those who are successful. The average income for Airbnb hosts in 2017 was $2,400. Additionally, P2P accommodation can provide income for service providers such as housekeepers, caretakers, and gardeners. And the chart over here shows that there is a significant difference in average income per region in Jamaica. So we can see that in a traditional resort area, such as St. James, which is Montego Bay, and St. Anne, which is Ocho Rios, average income for the host is significantly higher than elsewhere in the country, including Kingston. When we look at diversification, we found that Airbnb bookings show a different pattern than hotel stays. While the capital, Kingston, received only 10% of all international arrivals in 2017, 28% of Airbnb guests stayed there. And part of the reason for this is that overseas Jamaicans really like to rent P2P accommodation when they come and visit their friends and family. Interviews with providers indicated that overseas Jamaicans represent about 50% of the market in Kingston. Also, a wider range of source markets use P2P than other forms of accommodation. North America represents 81% of all international arrivals to Jamaica, but only 63% of Airbnb guests are from North America. We were surprised to find that domestic tourists, so people who are living in Jamaica, represent 6% of all Airbnb and TripAdvisor rental guests. This shows that P2P can attract a diverse market, which makes the sector more resilient to change. So thinking about the challenges, what are the issues in Jamaica? Security and rising rents are the main concerns for residents living close to P2P rentals in Jamaica. Neighbors in gated communities and apartments are concerned about sharing the entrance security codes and keys with non-residents. Licensing and taxation are challenges for policymakers and a concern for the hotel sector in Jamaica. There is currently no structure in place to enforce collection of the room tax for P2P providers. Low compliance with the licensing system is also very widespread. So in summary, when we look at Jamaica as a case study, what can we learn from it? We can see that the P2P accommodation can generate opportunities to benefit women, including hopefully in the future Gloria. P2P accommodation shows potential to diversify the tourism activity and attract new markets to new locations. But, as Louise mentioned, to be sustainable, regulations need to adapt quickly to the changes in accommodation offerings. P2P taxation needs to be resolved, and better guidelines are needed to address residents' security concerns. Now back to Louise.
Thank you, Martina. Let's tell them how to work. Thanks so much. I mean, there's clearly no one-size-fits-all. We've learned a lot from Jamaica, but we understand that's just one destination, and it might be quite different from destinations elsewhere in the world. But it did give us some insights. It confirms some of the things that we've seen through the research, and it surprised us in some other ways. The domestic tourism issue is a prime example. We didn't expect that, and it really confirmed that thing about this is a diversifying demographically force, potentially. So there's, as I said when I started, there's no one-size-fits-all. But we did realise through looking at this and through some of the other studies that I'll mention in a minute, that there are some things that you can do if you're a destination to help guide this process, to help get out of this scramble that regulators seem to be in over this new form of tourism. And the first one really is to get informed. During this research, we came across destinations that have made policy decisions overnight, banning a particular form of accommodation. To do this without full information at hand is a real mistake. The first step in any policy-making decision process should be some kind of diagnostic assessment. What does it look like? What's the scope and scale of P2P in your accommodation? Who's benefiting? Who's not? Who are the stakeholders? It's operating right now in a grey area, and it's very difficult to get a handle on where, in fact, P2P is. And without that information, there tends to be, and with the media as it is, there tends to be quite a volatile conversation occurring that is not the normal way in which policies are made. So let's take a step back, let's look at what the information is, and then let's make informed decisions to help guide this new engine of growth and entrepreneurship in the direction where it can be a positive force. The second area is around policy and planning, standards taxation, to help if there is proper planning and there is proper policy making based on information, and it's agile, like Martina said, so that it's adapted to this form of accommodation. This is not a whole set of standards for 5-star resorts that is suddenly being put on someone with one room in their house, but something that's quick and easy to get registered, to get licensed. It can help regulators know who's out there. It can help keep visitors safe. There are security risks. And that goes both ways. It's not about just keeping the guests safe. It's also about gender-based violence and the potential for women hosts to be at risk. So there are safety issues both ways that can really be addressed if we know who these people are. If they can stand up and be counted and be organized, then some of those risks can be reduced on both sides. So how do we make sure that at the same time of, in part, raising the barriers back up a bit, we don't marginalize the glorias of the world? It's about training and mobile banking support. I was thinking that in the previous session before lunch, there was a lot about, who are the winners and who are not in this conversation. And really the difference is, do you know how to use it? You don't have to have the dollars anymore. I think that's the super exciting thing about user-generated content. You don't have to necessarily be doing ads on TV, which cost millions of dollars. You just need to be savvy. But in order to be savvy, you need to be trained, you need to be informed. It was news to me from TripAdvisor's presentation is the power of the business owner to control that conversation. And that's obviously only going to happen when the business owner is empowered to take hold of their reputation and take hold of their digital presence. So digital training is absolutely essential. Mobile banking support is another key element. You can't do banking you can't use your online platform unless you have that facility. The fourth and last area is around developing the product and marketing. And this is to the DMOs in the room and also to those who are online. Once this area has been properly defined, we can take it out of that grey space and see it as a new product. We've had lots of new products in the past that have been highlighted and promoted. There's ecotourism, there's conference tourism, there's wedding tourism, there's honeymoon tourism. So this is another form of experience-based tourism that should be celebrated. It's not, it's not a challenge necessarily to the hotels and resorts of this world. It is in part, and perhaps competition in that front may have some positive spin-offs for everyone. But what we should really see is an expansion of the opportunities for a visitor in a place, which for a mature market can be a real plus. And for an emerging market can also be a huge benefit. So we have a foundation of understanding some of the issues now. We know we need to test some of these out. We've started to do this. I'm very grateful for Tao for coming today from Airbnb. We've been working over the last 6 months on some pilot projects around the world. There's a project in India and a project in Cape Town. Those two are really focused on that first idea I had about, training and reducing the barriers in terms of digital access. So this co-hosting model, which I'm sure Tao can mention a little bit more when we get to the panel discussion. And how do you enable poor women in a self-help group in the middle of Maharashtra to get involved and to benefit from this new form of income from tourism? And the other side of those set of pilots is around diversification. So Peru and Jamaica, we're looking at how can this new form of accommodation help diversify tourism from the honey spots. So you think of Machu Picchu, you think of the destinations in Jamaica where there has been such a focus on just one side of the country and looking at what is the potential there to build experiences that can help get people to out of those main areas. So that's work that's going to continue. It's the beginning of our work in this area, and not the end. And I'd just like to end by acknowledging all those who have helped provide research, who've peer-reviewed, who have guided through this very difficult, both politically sensitive and very kind of personal subject for a lot of people, to help us put somewhat of a framework around it. We really hope that you are interested in the report. We really welcome your feedback, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you. This is a fantastic report, and I really encourage you to read it if you haven't already. I know I got a lot of insight from it, and I commend the bank on this project, and I look forward to your continuing work in this area. Travel and tourism is a people-to-people business, and I think if we look at it, the peer-to-peer accommodations platform really has helped bring this to another level. But that relationship is nested in a community. And therefore, there are a lot of stakeholders involved in the successful development of this platform. And so there are a lot of dynamics around it, which I know we'll be talking about today and which are highlighted in this report. And so we have a great panel to discuss this and to bring life to these issues. First, we have Tao Nguyen, who is Airbnb's Director of Strategic Partnerships for Asia Pacific. And in this role, she leads the company's regional partnerships that advance Airbnb's role in promoting economic inclusion, women's empowerment, and sustainability, including with tourism authorities, multilateral institutions, nonprofits, and other private sector partners. We also have Ryan Steele with us. He is the head of research for the Caribbean Tourism Organization, and he oversees all of the aspects of the research function there. He's a graduate of the University of Oxford, and he's authored several publications, including the often cited Can Google Data Improve the Forecasting Performance of Tourist Arrivals? Mixed data sampling approach. So here's somebody who really can help us dig into this report and again bring to life the insights that were brought forward. Cristina Johannes Brutus joined the World Bank in 1997. She began working in the urban development anchor on topics such as solid waste management and slum upgrading in 1999. And she's been working on cultural heritage since 2002. During her time in the M&A, she has worked on operations in the West Bank and Gaza, in Lebanon, Jordan, and the Gulf countries. And of course, we have Ernesto Lopez Cordova, who is the practice manager that we welcomed us earlier for the World Bank's Finance, Competitiveness, and Global Partnership and Innovation Global Practice here at the World Bank. How one person can lead all of that is a subject, I'm sure, in and of itself. But I wanted to begin, Ryan, with you. In your work with the Caribbean region, you, of course, are on the front line of the destinations and the sharing economy. So what are the concerns of your members, and were there any surprises for you in this report?
Thank you for inviting me to this great panel and event. I think Louise did a very good job of explaining what the concerns were, but I can add to that. One of the main concerns, or the core concern really, is about competition. And the idea is that, there's not a level playing field when the Airbnb hosts don't pay taxes like the traditional accommodation sector, like hotels and so on. They don't pay taxes, they're not regulated, they don't have to follow standards, they're not registered, and the list goes on. So those are the core concerns. the interesting thing about the study that World Bank did with Jamaica is that, 35% of those listed never had a booking. So is it really as competitive as we think it is? It's perceived to be competitive, but maybe it is way different on the ground. Clearly, the supply way exceeds the demand, and that in itself is a self-regulating thing. So the idea is I think one of the quotes was that 2.4% of the guests stayed in Airbnb accommodations, and that is a very low percentage of the overall pie. So those competitive forces seem very weak in Jamaica, but that doesn't mean that they're weak everywhere else, in other destinations, or even sub-regionally in Jamaica. Maybe there are pockets of intense competition in Jamaica as well. I haven't seen the data yet, and maybe maybe we don't have that data yet. But it would be interesting to see that type of data. One of the other surprises is that most of the hosts are women, and that's a welcome surprise. However, the flip side is we don't know if those women are actually managing that that accommodation, or is a strategy by the men behind the women to put the women up front, to help manage or to appear to manage the accommodation. So again, more research needs to be done, but I think it's a very good first step.
Thank you. Cristina, in your work with the World Bank Group Urban team, you approach tourism from the lens of urban revitalization. So in your role, how have you approached working with digital platforms, and what opportunities do you see?
Thank you. I would also like to thank the organizers for inviting us, and our perspective is a little bit different. So we work on destinations before they're actually destinations. So we go into urban areas and we see the opportunities in urban regeneration, and this means a revitalization, usually in historic cores, often accompanied with sustainable tourism development. So our approach is a little bit different. We often go into these places and do things as basic as street lighting or designing the urban space in a bit differently. And then what happens oftentimes is we see improvements in safety, and we also, the whole point of urban regeneration is to encourage economic development. So this is where the sharing economy actually can fit in very well. So as this process goes on, what we see is with improved safety and security, for instance, improved services, basic services like solid waste management, water, these kinds of things, electricity, you often see businesses starting to crop up. And one example that I think is illustrative of this approach is what we were able to accomplish in one city in Lebanon. So this was a project, very long, one of the longest cultural heritage and urban development projects the bank has ever done. It was also the pioneer, so maybe that's why it took so long. But in the southern city of Tyre, which was a city affected by war, conflict, and over decades, the historic core includes a World Heritage Site. It's a port from the Phoenician times, and it was largely abandoned. There were fishermen that were still there, but the urban area, the urban space around it was largely abandoned. And as we started working in this area to improve the services, as I said, then we started to see something that was really pretty amazing, and that was these small guest houses started to pop up. And this was after it was and this is an area of Lebanon that is really perceived as dangerous. And during my last visit, during the ICR, the completion report, we noticed that there were significant number of these guest houses being in use. Not only were they in use, they were booked solid from May until about October. And this was the first year that they had kind of this big showing of interest, and they were being booked for $200 a night. So this is part of what we have been doing. The other thing that I think it's a good opportunity, it's been said before, is it offers social inclusion for marginalized communities that may be outside of the historic core or maybe in different parts of a country, but it offers them the opportunity to be connected to the formal economy. And again, very difficult and complex ways of doing that, but these are the types of things I think that are important for us to keep exploring and to keep thinking about and trying to offer some solutions.
Oh, thank you. That's a very powerful example of the kind of benefit that this platform can bring. Tal, I think as I gave your job description, I think there are a number of people who would be surprised to know that there is a person like yourself working in Airbnb. Can you begin by, I'm going to have a two-part question for you. I thought it would be helpful for you to talk a little bit about sort of very quickly the evolution of Airbnb from a technology platform to an organization that hires somebody like yourself to undertake the work that you do.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks so much, Isabel. Just even taking a step back, Airbnb is a global travel community that empowers people to share their homes via Airbnb homes and their passions and talents through Airbnb experiences. So just a little bit of background. In 2008, our co-founders were living in San Francisco, and for anyone who has lived or been to San Francisco, rent is very expensive. And so there was a big conference that was in town, and hotel accommodations were either sold out or were at that point just very expensive. And our co-founders thought, we have an apartment, we have an air mattress, why don't we list our air mattress and see if any guest will stay? The air mattress was booked, and there was the birth of Air Bed and Breakfast. And really at the heart of our community is our company's mission, which is to create a world where anyone can belong. And our senior leadership is very serious when they say creating a world where anyone can belong. And so that inclusion aspect of our platform is something that we think a lot about. Women make up 55% of Airbnb homes hosts and 50% of Airbnb experiences hosts. And for experiences, every experience is a hosted experience. And so the 50% of women really are the 50% of hosts that you'll see when you book that experience. As of now on our platform, since the beginning, women have earned $20 billion hosting on Airbnb, with $10 billion of that being in the last year. And so I think just thinking through some of those questions, I think it's very natural that we've been engaging and continuing to engage on area initiatives and opportunities that really help to support that mission. And we know that travelers on Airbnb are looking for local, authentic, unique experiences. And that creates a real opportunity to really explore what that demand looks like. And so 3 out of the 4 Airbnb travelers who we've surveyed always opt to stay in areas outside of the typical tourist circuit. And so we realize that the opportunity there is really real in terms of how can we explore that demand for emerging tourist destinations, and how do we continue to create tools to help facilitate that. Earlier this year, our company launched a global Office of Healthy Tourism to really build those tools and initiatives together with partners and really think through how do we really leverage technology to create more opportunity, economic opportunity for more people.
So that is what has led you to working with the World Bank. And so in your work, you're working with beneficiaries in many emerging markets. And I know some of the case studies or the pilot programs you're doing here with the bank. Can you just give us a flavor of what you do and maybe tell us what is the most, one of the more inspiring stories of change that you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll share one of our partnerships and initiatives that I think is most meaningful to us, and I think that will provide, I think, a little bit more picture in terms of the kind of work that we're engaging in, including with the World Bank. So for the last couple of years, we've been partnering with this incredible organization called the Self-Employed Women's Association of India, or SEWA. This is the biggest women's trade union in India and in the world, with 2 million women across India in the informal sector. And at the heart of that partnership is how do we really decrease the barriers of entry to new technology platforms so that women can benefit, so that we can be promoting these rural livelihood opportunities. And since then, we've launched a pilot in rural Gujarat with SEWA, and over the last couple of years have built out learnings from that. And I think one of the most powerful memories from that experience was during one of the first questions we had once we launched the partnership was, what can low-income communities in rural communities really offer in the tourism space? And before our team could answer, the director of SEWA actually got up to say, there's so much opportunity here. Our women's community have hosted people from around the world before, and we're excited to figure out how to do that at scale and really grow that opportunity for more people. And since we've started in that initial community, they've hosted over 510 guests. And I think have continued to be excited and engaged in the partnership to the point where women from that original pilot are sharing their learnings with other communities. And so we started in rural Gujarat, but since then the initiative has expanded to Northeast India. And I think really the idea of these initiatives is working really closely as partners, but also thinking about what does a sustainable approach look like. And ideally, at the end of the day, we don't need to necessarily be there for the day-to-day. And so even with some of the great pilot work that we've started with the bank, one of those initiatives is in India and Maharashtra. The women from our original SEWA initiative has been so excited that they have volunteered actually to come and join in one of the trainings for this new community. And I think that's a really great example of where a very community-centric approach is something that you can continue building on in an organic way. And I think some of the questions that have been raised in earlier panels is how do you continue to build a model that sets people up for success? And I think the training piece is so important there.
Thank you. That's a fabulous example. And then, Ernesto, that brings us to you. Can you tell us about how you see this as an opportunity for the World Bank Global Team, building on the success that we've heard here, maybe addressing some of the challenges? What are the opportunities that you see from your perspective?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And perhaps I would start by recalling the reference that Leslie Goh made this morning during the plenary session to the build, boost, and broker approach that the bank is following to leverage disruptive technologies and to address some of the risks that they may bring about. By build, what we refer to is to invest in the digital and physical infrastructure as well as in the regulations that are needed to be able to have the underpinnings of the digital economy. Here, Stephanie made a very staggering comment about that 60% of people in Africa are offline. So this just highlights the importance of building the basic infrastructure that is needed for disruptive technologies to take place, particularly in the digital space. By boosting, we mean how can we create the capacity, both in individuals, in firms, and institutions, to really be able to take advantage of the opportunities that disruptive technologies offer. Here, the issue of digital skills particularly in this panel, is very important. Again, this came up in the first session this morning when we talked about how these new technologies change the nature of the job place and the nature of the skills that are required. And the third aspect is broker. And here, the idea is that the bank is in a particularly useful position to be able to broker on how these technologies are used and how we can understand by piloting the applications of these technologies to address developmental challenges that can then be scaled up in a sustainable way, to address data gaps that we are currently facing, but that with these new technologies we can fill in. And the discussions earlier today about user-generated content are very much in line with this. Then the third aspect is on how we promote dialogue like this today, on bringing together different stakeholders to discuss the challenges that these technologies are creating and the opportunities as well. And last but not least, broker partnerships, both with governments, with local communities, and with technology firms. And here we need to take advantage of both our convening power, meaning the World Bank's convening power, and the credibility as an honest broker that can bring together different actors, different stakeholders, and together find solutions that are appropriate to the challenges that we face. And I think this build, boost, broker approach is very well exemplified by the two publications that we're putting out today and by the partnerships with TripAdvisor and with Airbnb. With TripAdvisor, this morning we signed an MOU to continue leveraging this data. And we had some exciting ideas that we discussed. And with Airbnb, we signed an MOU last year, which at first focused on, again, on exchanging data and information to understand and advise how we design projects. But actually, that received an important boost last October when President Jim Kim and Joe Gebbia, one of the co-founders of Airbnb, asked us and challenged us to think about how we could use the Airbnb platform in particular, but broadly, this P2P accommodation segment to promote inclusive development through tourism. And this is where the pilots that we have been discussing come in as a way to test new approaches on how we can use these technologies. And the work has really been on what can we do with these platforms or through these platforms to address challenges. And we already heard about these pilots in the case of Jamaica, to some extent India. We also work in Peru, in South Africa. And we've been gaining some very useful insights already through these pilots. We will continue to work in this to present a more full-fledged description of the lessons that we're seeing. And some of these have already been mentioned, but I will go through some of these insights. So first is the importance of sharing data and having timely data that allows us to design policies appropriately. This was very much the case that was illustrated in the case of Jamaica. In the case in the case of South Africa, we did a demand study of community-based tourism, which actually shows that the demand for this type of tourism services in Africa is expected to increase by 3.3 million visitors by 2023. So there's enormous potential there to exploit. So this type of analysis is very important to understand where the opportunities are. Second, which was also addressed, is making sure that policy does not fall too far behind these new models, and that we respond from a policy and a regulatory angle in an appropriate way that leverages these technologies. In the case of Peru, we're seeing that there's an ongoing debate locally on what appropriate regulation should be in this regard. We mentioned, or the issue of taxation was mentioned, and let me just offer a personal reflection here. I stayed in an Airbnb lodging for the first time this summer in Mexico City, and believe it or not, I was gladly surprised when I saw that the accommodation tax was applied when I booked through Airbnb. So I think platforms like Airbnb should not be seen as a problem, but they actually offer an opportunity to bring in this conducive regulation, taxation that is required. The third aspect, which has been mentioned already, is the need to invest in digital skills, particularly among women, among youth, who often have less opportunity to have access to good, well-paid jobs. Another aspect is how do we establish linkages through the local economies? And here, a good example is the Airbnb experiences and how this can serve to link the visitor to the broader community and not just the host. And last, but there are other topics, it's the issue of how we make sure that we spread the benefits, that we do not build on the destinations that are already successful. And here, the example that Minister Anab gave about the Jordan Trail was very much in this slide. How they have been working with Airbnb, with other technology firms, to promote tourism development in rural communities, which otherwise would not be included in this aspect. So maybe I'll stop there, and I hope that's.
I think that's a tremendous opportunity for the World Bank to add real value and to build on the work that you're doing. So thank you for sharing your vision. I think one of the things that we really have to look at is that in this presentation we saw that these platforms, of course, have this immense potential to diversify product and markets and to flex the inventory and to spread out the benefits. But there are also genuine concerns about the impacts of this subsector. And given the rate at which this sector is growing, it seems that addressing these concerns, maybe there is a sense of urgency behind that. Ryan, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what is going on in the Caribbean region with respect to the mitigation of these impacts and putting in regulatory frameworks.
Yes, the Caribbean in general is lagging behind the development of the sector, of the Airbnb sector and peer-to-peer accommodation sector. A big part of that reason is lack of data. We really need more data about who's using the platform, how long they're staying, where they're staying, the reasons for choosing this platform, and to be able to craft smart policies, smart regulation. Some countries in the region have already signed tax agreements, such as USVI and Puerto Rico. They have signed tax agreements, and they're about to, to be able to tax the guests when they book on the platform. But that is only for Airbnb. I mean, there are other platforms as well. And we really need to engage, and the other platforms should engage the destinations, the government officials, and so on, to work together to figure out how best to manage the sector, how best to regulate it, and to share data, because data is the foundation of making good regulations and good policies. It is quite possible to incorporate the peer-to-peer accommodation with the destination management and be able to work together to promote the destination. It is very feasible to do that, but first we need to meet eye to eye and share data, share information, and work together.
Makes perfect sense. I think that the question is about smart regulation.
Can I?
Yes, please. You had something to add to that?
Yeah,
Yes,
I would
of course.
love to add to Ryan's point in terms of I think there certainly are opportunities to work together with destinations and private sector companies or tech platforms to really amplify destinations in the way that achieve that destination's goals. So, for instance, in Sri Lanka, last month, we signed a partnership agreement with the Tourism Ministry of Sri Lanka, and then working really closely with the Ministry of Digital Infrastructure to look at Airbnb experiences as a way of amplifying and marketing the destination to achieve the goals that Sri Lanka has already identified in their national tourism strategy. For instance, diversifying tourism outside of the typical tourist circuit, as well as bringing more women into the tourism industry in a way that they haven't been able to before. And so together, working with that destination, we are working to identify potential Airbnb experiences that help to set a model for what that could look like. So for instance, one other area of the national tourism strategy is how do you look at traditional livelihood opportunities and bring those into the tech space. And so with Sri Lankan tuk-tuk drivers, for instance, they've been operating in this space for quite a while, and they're trying to figure out with technology, can we leverage technology now to really increase our livelihood opportunities? And so we actually brought a tuk-tuk experience onto the platform as part of a group of tuk-tuk drivers that have been directly trained by the Ministry of Tourism on safety standards and hospitality standards. How do we welcome new tourists into the country? How do we engage with tourists from all over the world? And so that's just one example, I think, of how companies and destinations can work together to really achieve the goals of that destination while bringing more people into the space for economic benefit.
Yeah. So between you, I think that you're talking about data-driven regulation and the need for additional data there, and then following up with training so that people can rise to those standards. I'm going to ask the panel one more question before I turn to the audience. But I wanted, Christine, for you to carry this question on a little bit farther in terms of the urban environment, because, of course, there are so many challenges with, quote-unquote, over-tourism and the role that this may or may not play in that. The dissatisfaction of some of the local residents. Could you speak to that from your perspective?
Sure. So as Tal was talking, I was thinking to myself, yes, national tourism strategy is great, but actually it's the local governments that feel the pain when it comes to taxation, when it comes to providing services, and oftentimes our counterparts are the local governments. And the overall sort of situation at the national level is quite different when you actually get down to the brass tacks of providing enough collection vehicles in a tourism hub and making sure that there is enough water during the high season and things like that. And it occurs to me that, when we talk about the challenges at the local level, we're talking about three aspects. We're talking about the private sector at the local level, which is different than the national. We're talking about communities, overall communities, and we're also talking about the local government. So it's great that Ernesto was taxed in Mexico City on his occupancy tax. I think that's really good because that means that the municipality is not losing out. A lot of times these local governments struggle with land use planning. They struggle with zoning. Developed countries and developed cities struggle with these kinds of issues. But if you go into a situation in a developing country, in a developing city, you will see that they are trying to tax tourism hubs a little bit more because then they can actually pay for the services and that they're not going to be reliant on the national government. So I think it's important for us to really think about these issues on the local level. So that means also with communities, not only the individual person who is benefiting, but the overall residential area. What does that mean? Because a lot of these places where we work, you have these amazing, iconic landmarks, but there's, it's the people that actually make the soul of the destination. And that's what a lot of visitors come to see, is not necessarily, of course, these amazing, places, but also they want to be part of the experience of living there. And that means that raising the quality of living for the communities as a whole, and also being aware that private sector is not as well functioning in these destinations on the local level as they could be. for instance, on the national level. So, how can we support local economic development and local entrepreneurs? Of course, this is an amazing platform to do that, but in addition to the accommodation sector, you also have other kinds of things that come into the value chain. So these are a lot of things that we have to navigate when we work on these type of issues and projects in these countries, and I think that it's important for us to kind of think through some of these, and I think that the data is amazing as a way of understanding, and oftentimes I use TripAdvisor when I go into a new place to figure out what the concerns are before we do opinion surveys and before we do really deep research and diagnostics, because you can have an instinct about these things, but you can really get a pretty good picture when you start looking at these things. So all of this is great. We just have to understand that the national picture may be very different when you start actually digging deep into the local.
No, that's a very good point. Now we're going to turn to some of the audience questions. One is that Airbnb, and I'm sure they mean also the general peer-to-peer accommodations, provides an opportunity for inclusion with a 59% of hosts being women. But the questioner wants to know, do the numbers exist to show whether or not it tackles inequality? And their point is that both in developed and lesser developed countries, it most certainly increases inequalities in their view, since hosts belong to middle or higher class groups. So they want to know, are they wrong?
Yeah, and I think the question around inequality, there are several factors there, whether it is the socioeconomic piece or even if it is, for instance, the gender piece, where, for instance, women in some areas are not able to leverage the tourism space in the way that they like due to other constraints. And I think just looking back at some of the examples that we've seen in specifically rural economies rural destinations with rural hosts, I think those stories really do shine out where despite your socioeconomic background and even in these low-income communities, you can still take advantage of platforms like Airbnb in the way that you want to engage. And I think some of the inspiration there is that we know that based on working with these communities, people are really proud of the homes where they come from. They want to share more about their culture, and they're excited to engage with a global community of travelers from all over the world. And I think that's where the opportunity is. So when we think about the inequality piece, to be able to focus on specifically some of those destinations. And we've been really optimistic with some of our work to date that's in partnership with organizations such as the World Bank, but also directly with governments where they're helping to inform where some of these emerging tourism destinations might be, areas where the government is also investing in other pieces of this much larger puzzle, building out connectivity. So how do you get to these destinations, reliable electricity? One example that I can share from Northeast Asia, where we're working with a local government in building out a village destination outside of an already well-established tourist area. We're working directly on the ground with a local partner, but as one piece of this larger puzzle where a government strategy is already in place to build out this destination, and they're working with different kinds of partners to really add substance and tools to that.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Louise?
Can I address that
Certainly.
as well? I think according among the peer-to-peer accommodation sector, I think Airbnb is very socially responsible compared to many of the other platforms. I think certainly the peer-to-peer accommodation has spread the benefits of tourism wider to persons who would have never have directly benefited from the tourism industry. However, as in the case, especially in the regional when I say region, I mean Caribbean context, we see that a lot of the hosts are middle income and upper middle income, are renting out their entire homes or second homes, and they're the ones who are really benefiting from this spread of the Airbnb and other platforms. The Glorias of this world are struggling to get even one booking. So I do think there's some truth to the widening income inequality, and we have to figure out how best to address that. I think it was said before that these platforms are great, but they do not solve all the problems by themselves. So we, the policymakers, have to figure out how best to address that with the engagement, of course, and the help of the same platforms. One way is to try to market the cultural experience of those rural or those pockets of lower income but very culturally rich areas, and if we can really promote that and market that, and of course add a layer of security and safety to those areas, then I think you might see the benefits spread even to the lower income households as well.
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
Can I jump in on the
Yes.
same issue?
Certainly, absolutely.
You were asking earlier about the concerns that we have regarding this discussion. I would say that for me, one concern is, or a big concern is, that the fear of these new technologies would lead us to block the technologies from arising. And there are some maybe valid reasons why these fears exist. Others are not so valid. But one of them is, what is the distributional impacts that these technologies have? And this question is along those lines. And certainly a valid question. But I think that's where the accompanying policies that help these lower income households or individuals to be able to tap into communities become very crucial. We talked about digital skills, for instance, but one could think, for instance, also about policies that promote access to finance, which is required to really be able to leverage the unused assets or the extra bedroom that you have in your house to be able to bring in these lower income households to this segment of the tourism industry. So I think this opens up questions about what are the additional policies that need to be put in place so that everyone is able to tap on the potential benefits of these technologies.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. Louise, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the responses, is this working? Yeah. All the responses have been great to this question. I think what we were trying to show in the report, it's not it's a inequality increaser or it's an inclusive model. It's not one thing or the other. If we can move away from this, it's this or it's that, I think we do a lot of good here by really looking at the nuances. And I think what the space changed so fast just in the space of time that we were working on the issues. I think it's important what we started to see, that there's a life cycle too to the phenomenon. And the entrepreneur there's also a sequence. Say you may start as someone who has one room in your house. You may then migrate to someone who is managing several properties. So that migration is occurring, and it's the survival of those who are doing business better, as in many other forms of economic activity. So those who have the edge, those who have the training, those who have the means, the better homes, particularly in a place like Jamaica. Let's not forget that there were security risks at play in Jamaica, which may have meant a bigger than normal emphasis on those homes that were secure, that did have that extra layer of luxury, having the security guard in the front. I think that migration happens, and I think that's something we need to learn more about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It does strike me in listening to your responses that, number one, it is a shared, genuine concern between the public and the private sector, and that really what you all have brought forward is the need for the public and private sector to come together to address these concerns. You know, as you point out, the individual owner really needs to be in an ecosystem that will draw people to experience that particular cultural thing. I think this was the example of Lebanon as well. You need the marketing and the inspiration of the traveling public to want to come to those areas, and you need the private sector to provide for the security. That does imply, of course, that there is, you were talking about strategies before, that people are conscious about. There's a certain amount of organic development, but this conversation lends itself, I think, to sort of a larger strategic conversation. We do have a lot of questions about taxation. How do you collect taxes? How do you plan on dealing with them? I think in this study there were also some observations about one of the disruptive aspects, aside from the point that you made earlier about if you're using the resources, you have to also, public resources, you need to apply back into them, but also that in traditional models, I think the study said, we have traditional models where a lot of the destination managing or marketing organizations are funded by hotel taxes in particular. So this is sort of disruptive to that model itself. And so I'm wondering, I know Airbnb is I think you mentioned a very good corporate citizen in this area, so I'm going to hold on you just for a moment and turn to the example of the hotel sector in the Caribbean. Is there a good example within the Caribbean region of where, from the hotel standpoint, the hotels and the community leadership have come together to resolve this problem, whether with Airbnb or another organization?
And this is regards to taxation?
Yes.
Yes. Like I mentioned before, there are a handful of countries in the region, in the Caribbean region, that have signed tax agreements with Airbnb in particular. But there are recent sign-ins, like 2017 of sign-ins. So we have the example of USVI, Puerto Rico, Curacao, and a handful of others. Barbados is also thinking about having a tax agreement as well with Airbnb, and they're trying to even broaden that to include all of the platforms as well. It is not easy, and it is still very nascent in its development, but we do see the need and the importance for having that taxation, because like was said before, they're using the hosts are using the assets of the country to benefit, but if they're not paying their fair share, then it's unfair. So a number of countries are actively looking at it, and I believe there'll be some more movement in that direction. In particular, Airbnb has been very good with negotiating with the countries and collecting the taxes on their behalf and so on, which is really remarkable.
Is there a resistance to, you talk about sort of cooperative agreements, is there a resistance on the part of destinations to require it? That if you were going to be operating, that the platform be required to collect and provide taxes? Is there a resistance to that? I mean, just out of curiosity, why are they operating on consent?
It is really hard to say what the challenge really is in each destination, but policymaking is a little slower than technology, and one of the main things is that they're trying to grasp what is it that's happening really. What is the impact of this sector, and do we really even need to tax it? Because maybe it's only a handful of people that are using it, but we don't really know the extent of the penetration of the peer-to-peer accommodation sector. So part of it is just a lack of data. They don't have enough data to make informed decisions. That is changing, especially with with agreements with Airbnb. But there are a whole host of the peer-to-peer accommodation platforms that don't share any data at all, and we have no way of knowing, how best to address that. Of course, there are ways to make it mandatory. I know there are some cities. I think maybe San Francisco might be one of them that has made it mandatory that if you register on a platform, then the onus is on Airbnb to communicate who is registered on the platform and share that information with the destination. I don't think that the level of discussion has gone that far in many of our destinations.
In those areas. Okay.
But that is certainly something that needs to be looked at as well.
Okay, thank you. One of the interesting questions here is, why don't we see more innovation like peer-to-peer sharing in the public sector, especially from policymakers in how they can include all community stakeholders or who are directly impacted by the tourism experience? And what are the barriers to that kind of sharing? Cristina, perhaps you might have some insight. I think perhaps to broaden the question, it doesn't necessarily require a peer-to-peer platform, but what is the best practice of communities coming together to engage all stakeholders in these kinds of conversations?
Well, that's a very difficult question because every place is different. So, for instance, when you have the way the bank works when we go into a project is, especially when we're going to an urban regeneration project, it's not just the physical interventions and improvements, but we also look at the social parts of it. And we have a whole system of citizen engagement where we actually go out to communities and we look at their needs and priorities and offer a way for them to close the feedback loop when it comes to what they are expecting and what they need from a project. So I think that the public sector in this case is often behind the curve when it comes. It's always a private sector initiative that kind of spurs this kind of thing. Let's be real. The public sector in a lot of the countries that we work in has outdated policies and sort of, the ministries of culture and tourism that I work with oftentimes are pretty, kind of stuck in the 70s and the 80s when it comes to some of these kinds of things. So it's a difficult thing for them to kind of now being, kind of engaged in the latest cutting edge technology type of discussions where even the city of San Francisco is having these discussions and hasn't come up with a really great model. But having said that, I think that oftentimes, as is the case, is community groups and activism and having that space for that innovation can work, depending on the place. But let's, my caution is let's be, have some reasonable expectations of the places that we're actually working in and what their limitations are. A lot of times it's staff. They absolutely have no training. There are not enough people. So it's a lot of different things.
Thank you. Yes.
Perhaps complementing now from the perspective of our department, which focuses on private sector development. And here, what we find is that a key obstacle to promote development in general and development of private sector activities is the problem with coordination failures, quote unquote, meaning the need for different actors to be able to coordinate and come together, and oftentimes by themselves not being able to address a particular bottleneck, a piece of infrastructure that might be missing. And in this regard, a lot of the work that we do, be it in tourism or in agribusiness, on promoting value chains, involves bringing in stakeholders from the private sector, from the public sector, to understand what those missing pieces are, what the problems in coordination are, and then to be able to address those. And the work that we do in tourism in particular involves a very close interaction with the private sector, with the public sector, bringing them together, again, taking advantage of their the role of the World Bank as an honest broker in stimulating a dialogue among these different parties.
And if I could just add on and build on that, recently we had an experience where we went into a destination, we said, okay, we need to do a kind of a visioning, strategy development thing. And it was the first time that the tourism operators and guides were in the same room with the Ministry of Tourism and the Ministry of Antiquities, and that they were all having this conversation together. So that's really where we are. Sometimes it takes something like that for us to actually, as Ernesto said, be the convener of this kind of thing. So that's a pretty basic level of understanding there that needs to be before you can go further.
Yeah. Do you have something to
Yeah,
add?
I would love to just add to both points as well. I think, especially when there is such like a wide diversity of stakeholders, and especially I think for newer players, it's not always easy to get a seat at the table. And so I think that a lot of the great work that the World Bank has been doing in bringing those actors together has been really important, and especially I think really pulling together data from many different players across the industry into analysis that actually is building on true data and insights. I think one of the challenges that we've seen as well in terms of really trying something for the first time, trying a new initiative in our partnerships with governments is sometimes it really just it takes a real concrete case study to build from, and it's hard to sort of envision what could be without starting somewhere small. And so very optimistic about some of the pilots that we have been able to launch with the World Bank to continue building on those learnings.
Oh, thank you.
And just one quick
Yeah,
point to
sure.
that, yes. In our experience, the ministries of tourism are very, they see the importance of having these conversations and of solving and resolving these issues. The problem is that the other ministries may not see tourism as so important, right? They have other priorities, and in many cases requires their assistance, requires the Ministry of Finance input, the Ministry of Economics, and so on. And they just have different priorities. So it is quite difficult to get that coordination, as you so aptly put it, coordination failure, and it often happens. Mm-hmm. Yes.
This is not necessarily seen as a priority. Well, what a great conversation. Thank you all very much. So it's clear that the sharing economy has extraordinary potential to create opportunities and extend the benefits of the visitor economy. I think those opportunities have been brought out, and I think reading the study, there are even more to consider about opening up destination capacity, about providing access to new locales, about inclusion in new travel experiences, and providing economic benefits both for communities overall and for hosts. So I think it's equally clear that we have a lot more to learn about this to really ensure that we maximize the potential of the peer-to-peer platform. And so I think there were some suggestions moving forward about the need to share data and to ensure that we have good data in order to drive smart policy. So I thought that was a very tangible recommendation. I think also the need to invest in digital skills to ensure that we have that level of inclusiveness across different populations. It's clear that we need to do some additional research on the question of best practices in regulation and taxation. I think one of the questioners that I wasn't able to get to said, well, if developed economies can't figure this out, how can developing economies figure this out? So it seems we're all figuring this out together. And given that this sector is rising, 6 times faster, I think there may be some urgency around these questions. What skill sets and what kind of financial support is needed to ensure that we can spread these benefits. And I think looking at the report, there were a number of different other elements that I think are there for consideration. For example, the nature of the kinds of jobs or entrepreneurship that can help drive the strategies of destinations which the World Bank is advising. So again, I encourage everybody to read the report. I encourage the World Bank to take on board some of the advice and feedback because clearly this is a really good foundational piece, and there's a lot more, I think, delicious work to be done in this space that you all are in a unique position to do. So I would like to thank our panel. I really think they've done a great job. I'd like to thank the World Bank for this report, and thank you all for your kind attention.